So at 4:13 a.m., I stumble in the pale darkness to my choir stall. When I finally look up through the west-facing window of the Abbey Church, the luminous full moon is setting through a light haze. We begin to chant the early morning office of vigils, a ritual that unfolds day after day, month after month, and year after year in monasteries all over the world. This was a 2014 retreat, and it inspired the questions that would become my PhD dissertation that I'm writing now. Can't hear me? It's so loud. There we go. It's going to turn off in a second anyways. All right. So my questions for this dissertation were, how has the monastic tradition contributed to the management of monastery landscapes? What about the environmental discourses in contemporary society? What might we learn from the monastic sense of place in an era of ecological displacement? Monasticism in the Christian West began in Egypt with St. Anthony, who fled to the desert to live a life of solitude and strict asceticism. The silence and nakedness of the desert landscape was an icon for the silence and simplicity sought within. As St. Jerome wrote, "The desert loves to strip bare." The landscape was not simply a metaphor, but a gateway beyond metaphors. It was apophatic in the monastic parlance, beyond the image. While hermits are called to living a life of solitude, cenobites, as they're called, live communally under a rule and a superior. This can be done in cities, but more often contemplative monasteries of men and women are found in quiet, remote, and beautiful places. As a researcher and a convert to Catholicism, I became something of a contemplative ethnographer in 4 such men's monasteries located in the American West for about 12 days at a time, chanting, eating, working, and praying with the monks, learning the contours and rhythm of each community with my own out-of-place body. What time to wake, when to be in my choir stall, when to make the sign of the cross, when to stand, when to sit, and when to bow, where to line up for meals. I conducted 50 interviews, some of them seated and some of them walking. And for those of you who have done interviews, you know that interviewing is itself a kind of contemplative practice. One must focus on what the subject is saying while constantly bringing oneself back from distraction, like a seminar. In writing the chapters of my dissertation, my task is now to interpret the meaning of the words that I recorded. But I'm also paying attention to the spaces between the words of the monks and my own. On December 10th, 2015, after a walking interview in Big Sur, California, I recorded this in my field notes. What is left unsaid, what they cannot say much about, except in affirmation, are the small things. The walk from cell to chapel, the stars, the ocean, because the words are not there. These are silent, contemplative aspects of embodied experience. There were plenty of silences in our interview where we were both simply walking, perhaps wondering what the other was thinking, feeling pressure to speak or ask a question or to say something useful for the recorder. But underlying it was the understanding that what we experience is not always shapeable into words. That what the sunset reminds us of is a thin veneer of the profound solitude that lies beneath it. We were creating a place together. The interview was not predicated on getting to the bottom of what his world was really like, but what the world was like between us. And this is what I mean by spiritual ecology or contemplative ethnography, describing a relationship between an inner and an outer landscape within contemporary discussions of religious and environmental studies. But what does it matter in an era of ecological catastrophe? The Anthropocene is dawning and industrial humans are at a crossroads. The contours of nature and wilderness are being warped from within and without. Our role in the biosphere is being vigorously debated. We need policy changes, mass movements, technological innovation. But environmental ethicists argue we also need a revolution of the human heart. In diagnosing our melees, Lynn White Jr., a historian of medieval technology, laid the blame for the ecological crisis not on mushrooming population or government oversight, but on the fundamental axioms of Judeo-Christian civilization, Christianity. Since that time, scholars and activists have been scurrying about trying to retrieve traditions, scriptural passages, and practices from the world's religions, trying to reconnect spirituality and the environment. As a result, some are pointing to what you might call a greening of religion or a greening of Christianity, while others suggest that mainline churches haven't really budged in their perceptions of the environment or their behaviors. So it's within this line of inquiry that monasticism has garnered increasing attention as a case study in the relationship between belief, sustainability, and sense of place. My first stop was to New Camaldoli Hermitage. It's in Big Sur, California. The community was established in 1958 by Italian monks. They emphasize the hermit tradition and spend more time in silence than other communities. The Hermitage is located on 880 acres in the Ventana Wilderness in the Santa Lucia Mountains. Coastal live oak dominates the erosive, fire-adapted chaparral ecology, and the narrow canyons shelter the southernmost reaches of coastal redwood. The area is also habitat for a recovering colony of California condors. And the monks make their living by hosting retreatants, and they run a small fruitcake and granola business. What is clear is that a quiet, natural setting is conducive to the monastic life of prayer. And in this chapter of my dissertation, I argue that the management of these landscapes is liturgical, in the sense that management values integrate the land into Benedictine spirituality. The land not only populates the prayer life of monks through silence, solitude, and beauty, but it also affirms monastic identity and history. In the Rule of St. Benedict, he says, "Let the monk regard all the utensils of the monastery and its whole property as if they were the sacred vessels of the altar." Guided by this ethic, the Benedictine motto, ora et labora, or work in prayer, has come to be synonymous with the order. In terms of history, New Camaldoli recalls their mother house in Italy, and the monks are very proud of their order and its history of forest management in Italy. Reflecting on his identity as a monk of New Camaldoli, one monk said, "I'm here to help maintain this property, and this property helps to maintain me on my spiritual journey." Another monk, proud of his monastic heritage of living on the land, recounted, "We actually go backwards and make ourselves slaves to the land and to the place and find freedom there. Instead of working the land to be free of it, to get our independence, we become slaves to the land." I love that, he says. And even our vow of stability, I'm going to stay here. I'm not going anywhere else. There's a certain kind of indenturedness about it. But it's freely chosen in a Wendell Berry kind of way, he finished. In my interviews, the monastic values of silence, solitude, and beauty were consistently described as being upheld and populated by the land. The eternal horizon of the Pacific Ocean, the enveloping coastal fog, the precarity of fire, earthquake, and drought were not just a setting for a way of life, but elements which participated in the spiritual practices of contemplative life. To use a monastic term, the land incarnates. It gives flesh to their prayer life. And that is part of what I mean when I say land management is liturgical. The Hermitage thus has gone to great lengths to protect these values. They prohibit tree cutting and hunting and fishing and the spraying of synthetic chemicals on their property. They maintain fire roads and walking paths. In the 1990s, they lobbied against the impending sale of an adjacent property, which is now a state park. The monastery acts as a kind of sanctuary to the world, much as protected areas do. The monastic's whole life is focused on seeking union with God, an experience beyond words. The land plays an important role in this central purpose. However, as monastic communities have opened up since Vatican II, and decreasing vocations have required additional help from seculars, as they call us, environmental discourse is playing an increasingly important role in each of the community's approach to land. In this chapter, I describe that influence. The second monastery I visited was New Clairvaux Abbey, which is located on 600 acres of prime farmland in the California Central Valley. It is surrounded by orchards, but maintains a cloister garden that is shared with a flock of turkey vultures and wild turkeys. This Trappist monastery has grown prunes and walnuts since 1955. New Clairvaux's orchards are not organic, but managed by industry standards, using conventional methods of irrigation and pest management. The monks are concerned about the impact of the chemicals on the wildlife and guests, but have, as of yet, been unwilling to risk the financial losses of converting to organic. So the monks there were less comfortable with the language of ecological sustainability and often spoke in terms of stewardship or cooperation between humans and nature. One monk related, "Learning to care for living things, cooperating with them to make them fruitful is cooperation. With our help, we can make them more fruitful than they could be, for God's glory." Now, obviously, that's not quite the same as the natural beauty of a wild forest, but it's the beauty of the cultivated orchard, and that has a place too. Cooperation between man and nature. I see that as one of the fruits of this particular way of life. It's real cooperation. So in this chapter, I take a critical look at each of the community in turn and describe the influence that environmental discourses are having on their management and contemplative practices. Each community is facing increasing management challenges in the American West, such as invasive species, drought, erosion, biodiversity loss, increasing development, and each in turn will need to better manage or balance their monastic values with contemporary ecological science to better cope and adapt. Our Lady of Guadalupe Abbey was founded in 1955 when Trappists from a failed foundation in New Mexico made their way to the foothills of the coastal range of western Oregon. When they arrived, the previous owner had clear-cut the property and taken off. They replanted, and today the 1,300-acre property is covered with Douglas fir forests, mostly planted by the monks themselves. Though they began as grain and sheep farmers, today the monastery makes its living through a wine storage warehouse, a book bindery, a fruitcake business, and a forestry operation. In this chapter, I look at the monastic experience and sense of place. In one school of thought, perception of landscape is a semiotic problem. We socially construct meaning and project it onto an otherwise meaningless terrain. But anthropologist Tim Ingold counters that through living in it, landscapes become part of us, just as we become part of it. Human beings do not, in their movements, inscribe their life histories upon the surface of nature, as do writers upon the page. Rather, these histories are woven, along with the life cycles of plants and animals, into the texture of the surface itself. As I observed for the monastics, it is clearly both and. It's both of these things. They live in a world steeped with religious symbols, but also embodied spiritual practice. For example, the monks chant the Psalms 7 times a day, which are filled with land-based poetry. As one monk put it, any monk who has spent his life chanting the divine office cannot have any experience and not have it reflect or give utterance to the psalmody. The Psalms are a great template to place on the world for understanding it, and its language becomes your own. In this mode, the land becomes rich with symbol. The dormancy of fall speaks to dying, the fresh growth of spring, resurrection. A tree growing out of a rock teaches perseverance. A distant train whistle reminds one to pray. A little flower recalls St. Therese of Lisieux. A swaying Douglas fir points to the wood of the cross. A gash in a tree symbolizes Christ's wounds. In each case, the element of the land acts as a symbol within a system of religious symbology. And yet, there was also a sacramental aspect to the land. Theologically speaking, God's presence in the land is a real kind of presence that does not just point to, but participates in God. This gives an embodied, or in other words, incarnational quality to their experience of the land. In addition, the monks spoke of their experiences in terms of flashes of insight or moments of clarity that transcended specific locations or symbolic meaning. The monks, especially at Guadalupe, had sunk deep roots into the land and strived to be lovers of the place, as the Trappist adage goes. When I asked one monk if this means that the landscape is sacred, he paused and said, "I would say that it is loved." For my last stop, I headed to the High Pinon juniper deserts of New Mexico at the end of a 13-mile muddy dirt road surrounded by the Chama River wilderness. An adobe chapel stands in humble relief against steep cliffs. Founded in 1964, the monastery is the fastest growing in the order, with over 40 monks in various stages of formation. The monks primarily live on their bookstore and hospitality, but they also grow commercial hops for beer. In this chapter, I look at a curious finding. After interviewing several monks, a pattern emerged. After describing some moving symbol behind a flower or a tree, I would ask what it was called. Or as we were walking and a bird would fly by, I would ask what it was. As we sat on the banks of the Chama River, one monk described the spiritual significance of the changes of the seasons, pointing to a nearby shrub that was just beginning to leaf out in vibrant green, describing it to me and what would happen next. So I asked, "What is that plant?" "I have no idea," he replied. There were several notable exceptions, but the monks, for the most part, didn't seem to care all that much about names. During one walking interview, he was tired of me asking, one monk decided to make them up. "Well, that there's a Fred oak, and this here is the Lusitania trumpet." So what's in a name? On the one hand, I expected environmental literacy to include words and names in the book of creation. But on the other, monastic spirituality seeks to move beyond names and metaphor. As I walked along a narrow path with one of the monks at Christ in the desert, a mix of snow and rain fell onto the parched red dirt. Without any kind of prompt on my part, he said, "The one thing I have learned is that the truth is in the thing itself, and not in thinking about it. Okay, I said, frustrated, but isn't it important to know what things are called? He replied, it can all be in the knowledge bank, but it's letting go of that. There has to be a point where we're just in silence before God and in silence before the beauty that He's created without trying to put things on it. So rather than demonstrating, as I expected and hoped, a kind of traditional ecological knowledge or even a place-based environmental literacy, contemporary monastics have developed a kind of theo-ecological knowledge that recognizes every element, creature, task, or moment of ineffable grace on the landscape as an invitation to be present to the holiness that patiently awaits under the surface. Thank you. Sorry, I went a little over. Thank you. Broadly speaking, a tradition. So both Benedictine and Trappist.
What's the significance of that choice?
They're the most numerous, and they are the ones that have large pieces of land. They manage land. They are monks that manage land.
Just off the cuff, I would think
Franciscans aren't monks.
Oh, okay.
So they're actually friars, and so they're not cloistered monks.
Okay.
So there are so many orders it's hard to keep track of, and so a Benedictine Benedictines are monks in the traditional sense. Yeah. So, yes.
So were you surprised by the kind of, were you surprised by their relative ignorance?
Yeah, I was really disappointed. Oh yeah, no, I like in the second chapter I talk about, the orchard. They're like, yeah, we kind of want to go organic. It would be great for our retreatants, but we're just not there yet. And so I'm going to wrestle with that kind of like, a lot of literature saying that monasteries are these models of sustainability. They're not. They're models of living on the land and making hard choices about having to live on the land and stay on the land. But I'm also going to say that there's no reason you shouldn't know the plants on your monastery and, the birds. And there, of course, like I said, there are monks that are just right on it. They do know the plants. They do know the geology. They do know the birds. But for the most part, the monks are much more in this mode of like I said, apophatic spirituality, where they're trying to move beyond names and images and metaphors to a kind of a more, a contemplative spirituality. So, yeah. Well,
I'm not interested in it. That's not important.
It's active in the sense that it is informed by their primary mode of living, right? Like when I would ask them, why don't you take a field guide with you on your hikes instead of a rosary or the scriptures, they would just be like, you could, but that's just not how I experience the world, But then some monks would be like, I do both, Like it became very important to me to learn the names of birds, plants, and animals. And that was part of their formation in both monastic life and being connected to the land. So I'm both going to let them off the hook by calling it ecological knowledge, because it does tie into that apophatic spirituality, but I'm also going to challenge them and say that if you are serious about living in place, you should probably learn the names of the plants and animals that you live with. Yeah.
So that makes me curious about whether you seeing how place specific it was, the experience of landscape work in the office. And so that's what I wanted to hear. But just the idea that were you to pick up a monastery and just move it to another mountain or another space or another country, that landscape would be experienced by those monks in the same way or have the same value for them, or were there certain communities which you kind of got into the beginning of your presentation where it was like, this particular space, the place that we're in,
Yeah.
has a special meaning?
It's both and, right? Because they're very serious about their lineage as Benedictines or Trappists, and they're very serious about their, like new Camaldoli or new Clairvaux. They keep that knowledge inscribes itself on the new place. They bring that into it, and Catholic liturgy is very prescribed, so that all comes with it, and the Psalms are the same everywhere. But as what I'll try to argue is that a lot of that prescribed spirituality, even silent meditation, it's not just convenient that it's a quiet place, but that the place itself incarnates that particular practice of silence in that particular monastery. So both and, right? A long, rich history of they're conscious of the places they've come from and where they've been transplanted from, but they're also developing a very particular approach. In the back there?
Something back to the names, where they also kind of functions.
Of functions, like, well, give me an example. Well, if you mean in the ecosystem, not in like the, because for example, if you mean like, are they useful for medicine or?
They may have been ignorant about plants and flowers, but maybe they know when flowers and what.
That's what I'm going to say. Like they're literate in the seasons, right? And they know what's coming when, what's going to change when flowers are going to be where, when the Canadian geese are going to come and rear their young on the river. They know all of that, and I mean I'm sure they would say yes, right? I'm not going to make a value judgment about what's more important, but like what I'm saying is that the knowledge functions in the system that it exists. It's theo-ecological knowledge. The knowledge of the landscape informs the purpose of it, right? The practice. Do we have any time for more? Or are we out of time? One last question.
My last question is, they seem to be very capital rich.
They have a lot of money? Well, that's the feudal roots of monasticism are self-sufficiency. So whereas in medieval Europe, they would act like a manorial landlord, and they would extract tithing and rents. In North America, they can't do that. They don't do that in Europe either, right? So they have to be self-sustaining economically. And so part of what I'm going to be getting at is that all of their management practices, once they've taken care of that, like, staying in the black every year, they're all very much keyed into continuing and defending the core values of monasticism: silence, stability, beauty, solitude, and those kinds of things. And this offering to the world, their hospitality, that people should be able to come there and leave the world outside.
You gave an example of one of the sites being one that failed before moving to this new location in Oregon.
Yeah.
What's the definition of failure?
Good question. So these Trappists came from Massachusetts. It was during a wave of vocations. They had a bunch of monks. Now it's mostly on the decline. So they send out new monasteries. They established one in New Mexico, and in the 1940s and 50s, they were primarily agricultural, and they were trying to make that work in New Mexico. It didn't work in New Mexico, so they went to Oregon. It was a failed foundation. All right, we're out of time, right? Yeah, okay.